You will notice that even though I just turned this on, it is not amplifying sound in here. So the mics are just, we're live streaming today, and I'm going to draw things down a little bit because the live stream starts in 5 minutes. The mics are to pick up the sound in the room, not to amplify the sound, because we can hear each other just fine. Welcome. You'll notice that there's a lot of name badges up front. I think there's a lot of public transportation problems this morning between buses and the subways. So I think people will be filtering in over the course of our discussion, and they can hopefully catch up. But I am super thrilled about this topic. We have had some amazing discussions amongst ourselves in the planning of this conversation, and I am super excited about it. And Dorian is going to talk a little bit about how we're going to structure the conversation. I will just say, and I think that he's going to say a little bit more about this, that we have two really amazing speakers who are kind of generally associated with some kind of a left side, right side, but we're not talking in a kind of didactic, point counterpoint kind of discussion today. That's not the point. The real point is to understand the ideas behind economic mobility and inequality, and understand them, and to find where the common ground is, and to find out how we can move forward as philanthropic professionals with our own work. So let me just say this about Dorian. He is, I'm going to read a little bit so I get it completely right. I know you're a professor an associate professor at CEPA at Columbia, but importantly, he is also the co-director of the Columbia University Program on Labor, Law, and Policy, and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. And I don't know if any of you have seen him on MSNBC. He's quite telegenic and engaging. So one of the reasons why we chose him to do this moderation today.
Right, exactly. Now the real story comes out.
And deeply informed, I should say. I originally met him when I was briefly at the Russell Sage Foundation, and he was a fellow at the Russell Sage Foundation, which is a wonderful member of Philanthropy New York. And I was deeply impressed by his thoughtfulness and his willingness to engage all sorts of people within that organization. And I think that he's going to be an amazing moderator. So we're a little bit before the hour, but think that those people can just catch up. So Dorian, I'm going to hand it over to you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Michael, very much. Welcome everyone this morning. Let me just ask, since the live stream isn't up, if we should go around really quickly and just, is that okay? Oh. Well, hello out there, everyone, and welcome wherever the camera is. Welcome to Economic Inequality and Mobility, looking at the evidence to inform philanthropy's actions. And we're just going to do very quick introductions of folks in the room before we get started with our two panelists. Great, so let's jump here.
Good morning, Hi, I'm Taylor, and I'm chair of the Communications Associate of the U.S. Betsy Kress, Program Director at the Power Quarter State.
Aaron Jacobs, currently I'm the Foundation. I'm also a program officer. I'm Jeff Madrick. I'm an author and senior fellow at the Secretary. And I
Great, and we have two fantastic panelists here. My colleague at Columbia, Jane Waldfogel, who's a professor of social work and public affairs at the School of Social Work and a visiting professor at the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics, as well as Scott Winship, who's the Walter P. Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he's been at several other places, including Third Way and Brookings. You can read their fuller bios here on the website, for those of you watching, or on the sheet here, but I want to really use our time wisely And our two presenters will start with framing the conversation. We've had lots of conversations about economic inequality and mobility over the telephone in preparation. What we wanted to do today was to really focus on poverty, mobility, and economic opportunity, and specifically to focus on potential policy interventions to addressing what our two panelists, even though they might have some disagreements, there is a lot of consensus around the data and the measures of poverty, of mobility, which we all agree on. They will present for about 10 to 15 minutes each. They have some slides to start the discussion. I will then ask some questions to both of them and try to tease out what are some of the areas of agreement, especially around the policy interventions, and then we'll open it up for a fuller conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael. Scott, sorry, Scott.
Sure, no problem.
Michael and Mike.
Well, it's great to be here this morning. Want to thank Philanthropy New York for inviting me. If folks out in live stream land can't hear me, wave your arms. I won't be able to see you, but we'll have, I'm sure someone here will be taking care of that. Okay, so as Dorian said, kind of want to make the best use of your time. The way that Jane and I kind of thought to divide this up was for me to do a little bit about sort of what's happened, what are the patterns behind inequality and mobility. I think we'll have a lot of agreement there. Some disagreements may come out in the discussion, and then Jane's going to sort of, I think, move more towards policy. And that's probably where the conversation, I think, will go after that. Okay, so my slides always used to be dense and ugly. They're getting less ugly, but they're still dense. And this one's probably the worst. So the idea, this is just a chart to show you, to try to show what's happened to the income distribution over the last 60, 70 years. And what you see is a cluster of bars, 5 different ones. The one to the left is the bottom fifth of households, moving over to the second richest fifth of households, and then you can see on the right side, instead of showing the top fifth, I'm just showing you the top 5% because the action really changes the higher up you go. And in fact, if I had the top 1% or the top 10th of a percent, you'd see even more dramatic trends over time. I put top 5 because it fits nicely on the chart. So all of these bars are showing annual income growth, and each of the colors represents a different period of time. In each case, it's comparing peaks in the business cycle to each other. So what you don't want to do when you're looking at income trends is look at kind of the high point in the business cycle and compare it to a low point or vice versa, because you just don't get a good read of the longer term secular trend. Okay, so with all that said, I'll kind of walk you through what I've got. Oh, great. So starting with the blue bars, this covers essentially you can think of it as the 1950s and 1960s, which everybody talks about as a golden age for the middle class, for the poor, and in terms of income growth, it's really true. I mean, that just jumps right at you. So during the 50s and 60s, income growth was higher below the top than it was at the top, and it was even highest in the bottom fifth. So this really was a period where we had very strong income growth. Productivity growth was very strong. That was followed by these green bars you can think of as the 1970s, essentially, where income growth slows dramatically. I do want to point out one thing, which is that the 1970s weren't a fantastic year, a fantastic decade, even at the top. So the 70s were sort of a lousy decade for everybody. And that's important, as I'll get to in a second, because in the 1980s, you really start to see top incomes pulling away. And that's what this light blue bar represents. You can see growth compared to these other light blue bars down here. You're really starting to see income concentration at the top, starting in the 1980s. But I do want to point out that starts after this decade of relative stagnation for everybody, right? So I think when you hear stories about how income concentration has been behind the slow growth below the top, there's probably something to that. But I think the bigger factor is this slowdown in productivity that we've seen across the developed world, actually. High inequality countries, low inequality countries alike saw this big slowdown where we were having fantastic growth in the 50s and 60s and then much slower growth afterwards. The other thing I want to point out about the 1980s is it's really the only decade where you see increasing inequality below the top. So you can see that the second richest fifth had the strongest income growth, all the way down to the bottom fifth, which had the worst income growth. But in the 90s and the aughts, and you'll see I've ended at 07, just because we're not at the next peak of the business cycle. If you sort of included the most recent data, you'd be essentially comparing a business peak to a near catastrophe, right? We just avoided a second Great Depression. But at least through the aughts, through 07, before the financial crisis, inequality below the top didn't really increase. These dark blue bars show that. But again, the top pulling away. Okay, so this is kind of a second look at what's happened to the top 1% now instead of the top 5%. And I think the point I want to make here is when you start looking at the top, there are some real serious measurement issues that I think are really important to keep in mind. Very few people would argue that income concentration has not risen, and I'm not going to argue that today. But I do think that there is a strong case, and I won't get too wonky during this presentation, but we can talk about it more if folks want. I think there's a pretty strong case that the headline trend that you tend to see, this is from Piketty and Saez, so when you see top 1% figures, this is generally the line that you see, where income concentration went from about 10% of income going to the top 1% to 24% in 2007, dropped during the financial crisis, but it's on its way back up. So without getting into too much detail, a big question about measuring this stuff is how well capital incomes are measured. So you have labor income, you have capital income. Labor income is earnings. Capital income is money you get from investments, from saving. And there are some big problems when it comes to measuring that. So I have argued that because the measurement problems for labor income are much less severe, for the levels, you're understating how much income concentration there is because capital income is much more concentrated than labor income is. For the trend, it's not at all clear to me that the trend for capital income is different than the trend for labor income. So if you look at labor income, this orange line is the percent of earnings that went to the top 1% for commerce and industry workers. That's from a paper that Emmanuel Saez was co-author on. The green line is an extension of that he did with Piketty in his spreadsheet that you can find on his website. And what you find is certainly increases, but interestingly, you don't actually see a ton of action after 2000, right? Looks like this is a little bit higher than 2000, but essentially income concentration leveling off after 2000. This is something that you don't hear all that much about. Saez doesn't talk about it, but I think it's a really important detail to remember. The line under it is so these two lines are for workers. This line is earnings for essentially tax returns. If you're single, that means it's a single earner. If you're a married couple filing jointly, that means you've got two labor incomes in there. And you can see the trend basically the same. The levels are a little bit lower, and now 2000 is actually the peak of labor income concentration. The purple line is from a different source, from the Congressional Budget Office, which looks at households instead of tax returns, and which also includes estimates of employer-provided health insurance, which of course is becoming a bigger and bigger part of compensation over time. A lot of people say, well, that's just inflation that's going to the insurers. If the adjustments for cost of living are doing what they're supposed to do, then this is supposed to just reflect real gains to workers, not just inflation in healthcare spending. And what you see again is 2000 actually being the peak and the levels being quite a bit lower. So by this series, the share of income going to the top rises from about 4 to about 9 in 2000, and actually hasn't gotten back to its 2000 peak. I'll hold off for discussion for later if folks want to chat more about that. But I do think it's important, even if you're skeptical of some of these lines, there are some real measurement concerns here, which I think the best way to sort of tease it is you can see what happens here around the tax reform in 1986, which happened here. These don't include capital gains, and you can see the trend looks very different, but it's a big jump nonetheless, and that's also related to tax reform as well. So that's just kind of a little example of how some of this stuff ends up being trickier to interpret than you might imagine initially. Okay, so shifting now to mobility. I think probably everyone's seen a version of this chart. This is from the Pew Charitable Trusts where I worked 2 jobs ago. And essentially the idea is each of these bars shows a set of kids depending on where they started out. So these are kids who started out in the bottom fifth, kids who started out in the top fifth, and then the 3 fifths in between. And for each of those fifths, it shows you where kids ended up as roughly 40-year-olds. And what you see with any number of data sets that look at this is the thing that stands out is what we call the Pew stickiness at the end. So if you start at the bottom, 43% remain at the bottom in adulthood. If you start at the top, 40% remain at the top in adulthood. And then analogously, very few people fall to the bottom from the top, very few people rise to the top from the bottom. You know, this number has always been way too high for my taste. There are people who say, well, you know, but 60% made it out. But as you can see, you know, most people don't make it all that far. So, so the number of people that make it to, if you think of the middle fifth as the middle class, number of people who start at the bottom and make it to middle class or higher, you know, is generally on the order of 30%. If we had a world where family origins didn't matter at all, that number would be 60%. So we're quite a bit of ways away from a world where family origin doesn't matter. Same thing at the top. In the middle, interestingly, you know, you get a fair amount of upward, downward mobility within each of these bars. Okay, so that's what we call relative mobility. The idea is looking at where your parents ranked and where you then rank in adulthood. It doesn't say anything about do you end up better off than your parents were in real terms, in inflation-adjusted terms. That's called absolute mobility. So we can have a world with low and unchanging relative mobility, but still have a lot of absolute mobility, right? If everyone essentially maintains their station in life, but everyone's getting better off over time, then you'll actually have absolute mobility without relative mobility. And the absolute mobility story is generally a lot better than the relative mobility story. I think both are important, and we can talk more about that. But on the absolute mobility front, something like 83%, actually that number is wrong, I'm sorry. So about 84% of today's 40-year-olds are better off in inflation-adjusted terms than their parents were at the same age. At the bottom, it's even higher. It's like 93%, and that's partly because if you start at the bottom, you don't have anywhere to go but up. This number should be 93%. So if you just look at 40-year-olds today, compare them to their own parents, and it's adjusted for changes in household size because households have gotten smaller. That's a trend that doesn't reflect hardship. It's sort of a centuries-old trend, right? If you don't like the household adjustment, this number is unadjusted. So in inflation-adjusted terms, today's 4-year-olds, $26,000 better off than their parents were at the same age. It's comparing 2005 to 1978, I think. So that's a pretty dramatic and positive story, I think, particularly when you hear about income stagnation. If you look at, say, the median household income over time, how much that's changed, the headline figures you get from the Census Bureau, which have all sorts of shortcomings with them, is about 15%, I think. If you use numbers that I like, that I think improve on them, you get about 40% increase. So this 93% is much greater than you would conclude, even just looking at what I think are sort of the best trends in median income. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is who has kids and how many kids people have. Part of it is that the kid who ends up at the median didn't necessarily have parents at the median, so it's reflecting a lot of mobility. But again, something to complicate things a little bit, but to keep in mind. Okay. All right, so another complication. So to be clear, I've argued in a lot of places and view one of my professional goals is trying to convince more conservatives to worry more about relative mobility and limited relative mobility in the United States. That said, the best evidence from a couple different decades suggests that relative mobility despite being what I would argue inadequate, has not gotten worse over time. There are two big data sets people use. Panel study of income dynamics pretty much across the board shows that there haven't been any changes over time one way or another. This other data set, the national longitudinal surveys, there are several papers that found that between cohorts who were born in the late 1940s versus cohorts who were born in, say, the early 1960s, that relative mobility had worsened. So this is for people starting in the bottom fourth. Where do they end up? So for this earlier generation, 30% remained in the bottom fourth, and then in the next generation, that worsened to 46%. And so some of these papers have concluded there was a decline in mobility. What I did is I took another data set. The kids, unfortunately, are only in their late 20s so far in this data set, so it's not the perfect. Ideally, you want to look at 40-year-olds. But that said, with the data we've got, it looks like that mobility improved. Now, I don't believe that. Essentially, none of these changes are statistically meaningful. So essentially, the National Longitudinal Surveys ends up giving you the same conclusion as this other data set, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, that there hasn't been much change. Raj Chetty, smartest economist in the universe, had a paper out last year where he essentially found the same thing with tax data, that mobility hadn't declined over time. And I think, so I've got two more that I'll buzz through real quick. How do we look versus other countries? This is, a year ago, I would have told you the United States unambiguously has less mobility, relative mobility, than other countries. I'm less certain of that today because of a paper that came out in November from Miles Korak, Matthew Lindquist, and Bosch Mazumder, a Canadian-American and Swedish economist, who each looked at administrative data from their own country and coordinated so that they did all the measurement the same way. At the end of the day, they found that upward mobility in the United States, Sweden, and Canada was actually the same. Now, that runs against an earlier paper that was that's widely cited. I've cited a lot from Markus Jäntti, who's a Finnish economist, who essentially showed that the Scandinavian countries had much better mobility than the United States. So this is for each country. If you start in the bottom fifth, what are the odds that you remain in the bottom fifth? In the original paper, the United States was at about 42%, somewhere out here. But the issue was that in the United States, he was comparing family income to son's earnings, whereas for these other countries, he was comparing father earnings to son's earnings. Pew, a couple years ago, put out an estimate of father earnings versus son's earnings that's very consistent with this new Korak-Lindquist-Mazumder paper. And when you do that, the U.S. looks not surprisingly close to these other countries. And remember, in the Korak, Lindquist, and Mazumder paper, the U.S. and Sweden are the same. This is not based on survey data. This is based on survey data. These are all based on administrative data. So I think, at least for earnings, at least for male earnings mobility, I think a case can be made that the United States may not be as bad off relative to other countries as we thought. For income mobility, household income mobility, I suspect we still look worse than other countries. I'm actually in the process of kind of going through the estimates on that. But I think in that case, it ends up kind of being a story about marriage and lower marriage rates in the United States. Some evidence to back that up. And this is where I'll end. This is where I think the real American mobility problem in the United States is in the extremely limited mobility that African Americans have decades after the civil rights movement, right? So the blue bar, this is all, if you start in the bottom fifth, what percent remain in the bottom fifth as adults? And actually, so for family income, it's about 38% in the United States overall. That masks this big difference between, on the one hand, whites and African Americans. Now remember, if we lived in a world with perfect mobility where your family origins didn't matter, these bars would be at 20%. 27% is not all that far from a world where your family origins don't matter. So the big difference is these racial inequalities. But I think even drilling down there's a really interesting story. So this is family income still, but it's looking just at men. Here, again, white men, you've almost got a coin flip in terms of where you end up if you start at the bottom. Pretty remarkable. And for African American men, half who start in the bottom will remain there in adulthood. For women, you get the same pattern, not quite as severe, but you still get these big racial disparities. When you turn to earnings, this is the really fascinating part. So this is earnings of men, whites down here, again, not too far from the coin flip for African-American men, half stuck at the bottom still. But then you look at women. This just blew me away. So among white women, you start at the bottom fifth, 30% will be there. In adulthood, that's bigger than the male number. But for African-American women, it's essentially the same as for white women. And so what this says to me, the big reason you get this big disparity here, and that you get the big disparities in family income here, is because of family formation questions, not necessarily family structure, but marriage. Two incomes give you more family income than one income does. And so I think this points to a really unique problem for mobility in the United States, and probably a unique, getting beyond black-white differences, a really unique way in that the United States as a whole differs from other countries. So I'll just end there. Hopefully lots of fodder to chew on. So as Jane's next, I have a lot of slides behind this that I had no intention of getting to.
I love it. Can we go back to the skyscrapers? That's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, so we could talk about real quick if people want. I did this when I was at Brookings, just as a way to try to illustrate just how severe income concentration actually is. Again, I'm somebody who's written very widely that we worry too much about income concentration. You're going to think I'm crazy after I show you this. But so what I did was I took the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. This was when the Mission Impossible movie came out that Tom Cruise jumped out of the building. And I said, all right, so if you put the top 1% on the top floor of the Burj Khalifa, and then you scale everybody below them so that essentially altitude and income is the same. The median household will be on the 13th floor, way down here on the bottom, right? So that's pretty dramatic. On the other hand, if you put Larry Ellison, who's kind of perennially the richest guy in the United States, chairman of Oracle, you put him on the top floor. He made $550 million this one year. I think it was 2012 or something. And then you scale everybody else under him. Well, Mitt Romney, who made $22 million that year, ends up on the 6th floor. So essentially what this is telling you is the higher up you go, it's this fractal inequality, right? You just continue to get extreme concentration the higher up you go. I still think you have to make a case that this is having negative effects and that people don't deserve this income. But I think it shouldn't be denied that we have these really crazy levels of inequality. So I'll end there. Great.
Thank you, Scott, and we'll turn it over to Jane.
Well, that's great. I mean, we did coordinate a little bit, but it's actually worked really well because Scott has talked about inequality and mobility, and I'm going to talk about poverty and opportunity. So rather than talking about the same terrain and disagreeing with each other and doing a point counterpoint, we would actually be somewhat more positive and cover the points that each of us know a lot about and try not to be arguing throughout the morning. So I think we're doing well so far. So I'm going to talk about past, present, and future. So I'm going to go back to the war on poverty. There's our friend Lyndon Johnson. Some of us can remember when he gave that address. He declared here and now unequivocal war on poverty in America. And this has gotten a lot of attention. This recently the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty. And of course, there's the famous statement by Ronald Reagan, "We waged war on poverty and poverty won." But this is all estimating the trends in poverty with our official poverty measure, which we know is very badly flawed. So based on recommendations from the National Academy of Sciences panel, there's an alternative measure, the SPM, the Supplemental Poverty Measure, that addresses quite a few of the limitations with the official poverty measure. It sets more appropriate thresholds. It better accounts for the full array of resources, including both cash and non-cash transfers. So it brings in things like food stamps and tax credits, as well as work and medical expenses. The Census Bureau, through an administrative decision, has released SPM estimates since 2009, and it releases them alongside the official poverty measure. So that's why it's called supplemental. But they haven't gone back and done this historically because really it's too resource intensive to do this, and they were not given any additional funding to produce the SPM. So somewhat foolishly, we at Columbia said, well, hey, we'll do it. We'll go back historically, and we'll do it in time for the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, which in fact we did. So this group of us produced the first historical estimates using SPM. Scott and I were talking earlier, we've got kind of a cast of thousands at Columbia, undergrads, graduate students, volunteers, postdocs, faculty. We had one high school student who started working with us on our poverty stuff. So we did the first historical estimates using an SPM, and then we did another set of estimates using what we call the anchored SPM. So this is anchoring the poverty line with today's SPM poverty line, and then taking that back historically, adjusting for inflation. So these are some of the technical details. As I mentioned, the SPM improves on the thresholds. So our official poverty measure is actually based on a minimally adequate food diet back in the 1960s. And back in the 1960s, food was a third of your household budget. So you've got the cost of a minimally adequate food budget, food basket, multiplied that by 3, and that was the poverty line. Well, today food isn't a third of our family incomes, right? Our family budgets, food is about a 1/6, and housing is the biggest item. So the SPM is based on consumption of what's called a basic bundle, and that's food, clothing, shelter, utilities, plus a little bit more. And it's updated every 5 years. And then on the resource side, the official measure only includes income and cash transfers, things like welfare. So it doesn't include in-kind benefits like food stamps, WIC, school lunch. It doesn't include tax credits like the EITC and the child tax credit. These are now the biggest part of our safety net, especially for families with children. So we're spending a ton of money on these programs, and our official poverty measure doesn't count them in family incomes. So of course Reagan's able to say, well, we threw a lot of money at poverty and we had no impact, because you can't see the impact in the official measure. The official measure also doesn't subtract out things like work expenses, childcare expenses, and the infamous MOOP, which is medical out-of-pocket expenditures. So obviously there are some individuals who have very high medical expenditures that impoverish them, and you need to take those into account. And then the OPM has, the official poverty measure has a very traditional measure of the family, and most importantly, it doesn't count cohabiting partners. So if you have a cohabiting partner in the household, they're treated as a separate unit. So that partner might be poor, the single mom and children might be poor, whereas if you pooled them together, they might not be poor. And foster children were just excluded altogether. They were not in the universe because they were too complicated to count. They're a pretty vulnerable group, so they're now included in the SPM. So after doing all this, this is our anchored series, and the dotted blue line is the official poverty series. And you can see what Reagan was talking about. This would go back to 1967. Over this almost 50-year period, poverty goes up and down with the economic cycle. As Scott was saying, there's low points and there's high points in terms of the economic cycle. But at the end of the day, poverty back in the 1960s for the whole population was 14%. Today, it's 15%. So we fought war on poverty and nothing happened. The dark blue line on the top is the series with the supplemental poverty measure that counts all of these government benefits and that has more accurate thresholds, more relevant thresholds. And you can see it tells a completely different story. It shows that if we applied today's threshold, we counted all the resources, poverty today would be about the same, about 16% instead of 15%, but historically it would have been about 26%. So actually, poverty's come down 10 percentage points. That's 40% decrease since the 1960s. So it's quite a different story. The other thing that I love about the supplemental poverty measure is that you can back out the effect of government transfers. So what is the impact of government taxes and transfers? So we do this for the historical period. The Census Bureau does this every year when they release the SPM, because now that you're counting the benefits in family income, you can take them out of family income. Say, what if we took away school lunch? Poverty would go up 1 percentage point. What if we took away food stamps? Child poverty would go up 6 percentage points. I mean, you can do those kinds of estimates. It's very mechanical. So we do this historically, and back in 1967, the safety net didn't make much of a difference because this is when the war on poverty is just getting off the ground. Food stamps isn't yet national. These things are just getting rolled out. So back in 67, the difference between the blue line, the poverty line counting everything, and the green line, if we didn't take taxes and transfers into account, it's like about 1 percentage point. Today, it's more like 12.7 percentage points. So the safety net today is reducing poverty by 40%. Yeah, 12.7 percentage points. And we would never notice that if we only used the official measure. So by being able to use the SPM, this has completely altered our understanding of the war on poverty. And this work has been, incredibly widely cited. The Council of Economic Advisors picked it up for their 50th anniversary of War on Poverty report, and then it kind of went viral. So it got cited in all of these places, really based on the CEA report. So we've been able to show that poverty's fallen by about 40% since 1967, contrary to what the official measure would show. The social policy, the safety net, plays a substantial and growing role in reducing poverty. We can see that food stamps and tax credits are particularly important today. Saying food stamps reduce child poverty today by 6 percentage points. The tax credits reduce child poverty by about 3 percentage points. Those are the two biggest items in terms of the safety net for families with children. So this is all at the national level. So we're now starting to do these analyses at the state level. So we've got to adjust geographically for the cost of housing. So you can't really assume the same cost of housing. Think about the thresholds. The biggest item in the threshold is the cost of housing. So it's really important to get the state estimates right. So we're starting to do that. And then in New York City at the local level, we're starting to measure other aspects of disadvantage, because this is all about income poverty, but there's also material hardship, which is a very important measure. Are you having trouble paying for food? Are you having trouble paying for housing? Do you have to forego medical care? And then there's well-being. So are you in ill health? Are you in poor mental health? In New York City, with a measure of income poverty, the supplemental poverty measure, something like 20% of New Yorkers are poor. When we look at material hardship, and this is severe hardship, were you evicted or homeless? Were your utilities cut off? Are you in really poor health? That's 37% of New Yorkers. So 21% poor, 37% in material hardship. And when we bring in the ill health, are you in poor health? Do you have a major health limitation? If we sum up all the New Yorkers who either are income poor, have a severe hardship, or are in ill health, that's 51%. So it's really important to bring in these other dimensions. So we're doing that in New York City with a longitudinal survey. But all of this would be obscured if we only used the OPM. And I think it's important because I think it affects our political will. I think it really undermines our political will if we have a narrative that says we fought war on poverty and poverty won. And I think we really were able to alter the narrative around the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty. So I have a slide with President Obama, who's citing our work, finding that the poverty rate has fallen by 40% since the 1960s. And he's using it to say we have to set aside the belief that government can't do anything about reducing inequality. But I should have included a slide with Paul Ryan, because he's citing our work as well. So I just think it's great that we're being cited across the political spectrum, but also that people across the political spectrum now are talking about poverty. They may there's disagreement about inequality. There's disagreement about how much we should be concerned about inequality. There had been some disagreement about trends in mobility. I think the Raj Chetty stuff kind of put that to rest. But everybody's concerned about poverty and opportunity. So let me end by talking just briefly about the future. So, we have a better measure of poverty. That's great. I talked with somebody from the BBC when our numbers came out, and they said, but yeah, you still have 20% of kids poor. So isn't that the story, that you have such a high child poverty rate in America? It's not about measurement. It's about how many kids you have poor. So we still have an unacceptably high poverty rate. We have too little opportunity and mobility. I think we're both agreed on that. So some of you may have seen the work by Sean Reardon, a sociologist from Stanford, who's been calling attention to the large and growing achievement gaps between low and high income children. So what Sean does is he looks at children's reading ability or children's math ability, and he compares children who come from high-income families or low-income families. And he finds that there's quite a large gap in between those children, and those gaps have been growing over time. And they now eclipse the black-white achievement gaps, which, fortunately have narrowed over time. Bob Putnam, in his new book, a political scientist at Harvard, he has a new book, Our Kids, that's getting a lot of attention. He's looking at large and growing gaps in other factors that are related to opportunity. Now, he divides families by, are they high or low educated rather than high or low income? But it's, they're similar groups. And so he's looking at other often inputs to opportunity. Are they involved in extracurricular activities? Are they enrolled in preschool? And he has a series of what he calls scissor graphs, where he sees, used to be, it didn't matter too much what your family's income or education was in terms of, say, you're playing high school sports, and now you're pulling apart. It's the high-income kids who can play sports and the low-income kids can't. And he has a whole series of those. So they're both talking about the growing gaps over time. The work that I did last year when I was on leave at Russell Sage with Bruce Bradbury from Australia, Miles Korak from Canada, Liz Washbrook from the UK, we looked at these kinds of achievement gaps and input gaps, not over time, but across countries. So what we wanted to know was whether these kinds of gaps are larger in the US than they are in our peer countries. And our peer countries are places like Canada, Australia, and the UK. And this is in a book that's coming out next month from Russell Sage called Too Many Children Left Behind. And so this is just one of the graphs from that book. This is the children at school entry at age 5. And we're looking at the gaps between the children whose parents have college education or more. And that's the high education group. The medium group are they have some education beyond high school, so some college. And the low education group, they have a high school degree or less. And the gap in the U.S. Between the bottom and the top, the bottom and the middle is that blue gap, the 0.46 standard deviation. This is on reading at school entry, language and reading. And then the gap between the middle and the top is 0.54. You add those together, there's a 1 standard deviation gap in kids reading at school entry between the kids of the lowest educated parents and the highest educated. Well, so is that large or small? It seems like a large gap. A standard deviation is a big gap. If you had something that had a mean of 100 points and it was a bell curve, that would be a 15-point gap. That's a big gap. Well, some of the parents are higher educated, some are lower educated. Is that big or small? Well, we have parents with similar education levels in the UK, Australia, and Canada defined similarly. So again, we're comparing parents with a college degree or more, parents with high school or less. And in the UK, the gap is about 80% as big. It's only 0.8 standard deviations. And in Australia and Canada, it's more like about a half a standard deviation. So it's about half as big. And all of those gaps, the UK, Australia, Canada, those achievement gaps are significantly smaller than the US gap. The US gap, this is not a black-white gap. This is not a Hispanic-white gap. We can take out the kids who are black, Hispanic, the kids who are immigrants, and just look at white US-born kids, and we still have a larger high-low SES gap than the other countries do. And also these other, it's kind of a meaningless comparison because these other countries are also extremely diverse. They're also nations of immigrants. But the question always comes up, what is this really? This is about SES. This is about differences between parents who have high and low education. We could do it also by income, and we have, and we get very similar results. So to us, this looks like there's too many children being left behind. There's too much inequality going on in the United States because these other countries also have educational inequalities in the parental generation, and yet they have smaller gaps among the children. So in the book, we look into some of the factors that help explain this. And then as Scott said, I'm going to end with talking about policies. So in the book, we talk about 3 different types of policies. The first is providing more support for early learning. these gaps are opening up by school entry. These are gaps at age 5. This one standard deviation gap in reading skills, it's exactly the same gap in math skills at school entry in the States. It's also one standard deviation. So we know a lot now. We have a lot of evidence now on parenting programs for infants and toddlers. We know a lot about preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds. We have really good evidence based on randomized controlled trials, natural experiments. So one thing we could do is expand the availability of these proven programs, both parenting and preschool. Second, I think money matters, and especially money matters at the bottom of the income distribution, and especially in early childhood. So I think we do need to take, further measures to raise family incomes for the poor and the near poor. And these are through things like increasing the minimum wage and also expanding the tax credits, which are such an important source of income support. So there's the EITC, very well known, and then its little sister, the child tax credit, much less known, but I always like to mention it because it is an important source for families at the bottom. And then third, we're talking about achievement gaps. If we're going to raise the educational level of this generation of children who are going to be the next generation of parents, we have to do something about schools. And it's not either or. It's not early childhood or improving schools. It's not raising family incomes outside of school or improving schools. We have to do all three. So we have to recruit, support, adequately compensate more effective teachers. We know a lot about that now. We have to implement more rigorous curricula for all kids, and have higher expectations and more support for low-achieving students. We write off low-achieving students in this country to an extent that none of our peer countries do. Finland is the great example on this. Half of kids in Finland get some kind of special assistance as they're going through school, and they all take the same curriculum through secondary school. It's one set of standards for all kids. And some kids need more help to master the material at different ages or different grades, and they get that help. But they're not confined to a separate track, a separate curriculum, and written off as low achievers. So we need to do the same thing. And then more immediately, just given the current political climate, I feel like we need to say we also need to make sure that we don't erode the safety net that we do have, and in particular, these programs that I've stressed are so important in reducing poverty among families with children, and that's food stamps, and it's the 2 tax credits.
Great, thank you, Jane and Scott, and you've both given us a lot of food for thought, and not all of us in the room are data geeks. And so there's a lot here. So I have 2 questions, then we'll open it up. But the first question is, if you both could talk to us a little bit about how different ways we measure these phenomena have implications for policy interventions. And you both talked about that a little bit, but if you could just spell it out clearly, how does it matter? And then who should we be paying attention to in terms of the right measures for these things? Everyone can't read, although I can't wait to read your book, Jane, but I mean, it's a lot, right, to try to digest and understand, okay, so which measure is the right one? How should we be thinking about this? So what are the implications for policy interventions based on how we measure all of these things, whether it's poverty, inequality, mobility?
Well, I guess I'd make 3 quick points. So to answer a question about how you become a good consumer of this stuff, given that you don't have time to take a PhD program and wade through all this stuff on your own. It's tough. I usually, there's a lot, there's a lot of really inaccurate statistics out there. And the best I can say, I think, on that point is to find people, read people who go against sort of your priors. I think that's always a good idea. But find people who also look like they're honest brokers and are presenting honestly the other side's facts, who are telling you what's wrong about them, what they don't like about them, and who shows you better numbers, right? So you have some people who kind of show the inequality trend, and they're like, here's 18 things that could be wrong with this trend, and then they kind of move on. And to my mind, that's not enough. You have to actually show, well, if you look at it this way instead, which is defensible because of X, Y, and Z, here's what you find. So I think that's the easy answer, the easy question number 3. Second, I would say it makes a huge, it's incredibly important, I think, for policy analysis. So a big reason why I used to be pretty liberal and have moved to the right to a fair amount is because my read of the data increasingly was that the middle class was a lot better off than I think the kind of national democratic agenda would have voters believe. I care a lot about the poor. I care a lot about upward mobility. And to my mind, focusing too much about the middle class being kind of one bad break away from catastrophe diverts resources, it diverts scarce tax dollars away from things we could be doing to help the poor. If I'm wrong and you disagree with me, ultimately it's got to come down to the data, right? And so I think interpreting the data correctly is incredibly important. And then third, just to add another layer of subtlety and complication to all this, I agree with just about everything Jane said. The issue of kind of whether the safety net is reducing poverty or not, I think is also more complicated, right? So so the first order effect of giving people more money, especially, or more benefits generally, is to reduce poverty, right? Definitionally, you're reducing poverty. There is potentially, and there's not strong agreement on this, I think, there's potentially a second order effect, which is if the ways that you're giving people more money have bad incentives, then in the long run or intergenerationally, you may actually be sort of pushing, you may be putting upward pressure on poverty, right? If people end up, what they would have done in the absence of getting benefits is something else, then looking at the trend in pre-tax and transfer poverty isn't necessarily what would have happened, right? So all of these are incredibly complicated issues, and I think it's really important just to search out diverse views and find honest brokers on both sides. Hopefully we are.
Yeah, I mean, I thought as I was presenting the graph showing with and without tax and transfers, I was kind of gliding over usually what we would say in writing is that, so that's an accounting exercise is what Scott's talking about. So you just take away the benefit or you give people the benefit, but there could be behavioral effects of giving people a benefit, and those could act to increase poverty or to decrease poverty. So the EITC actually could have a further knock-on effect on poverty because it incentivizes work, and so we're not capturing that. But something else at the margins might, if you give people a lot of benefits like disability or something, that might reduce work. And so all of these exercises, the Census Bureau does it, we do it, other people do it. It's just mechanically taking away or giving people benefits, but without the behavioral effects. And so there's always some, ample footnotes that talk about the behavioral effects and what those might be. In terms of the measurement question, it feels like we're living through a data revolution. This is the best of all times to be measuring poverty and inequality. And perhaps it's because we have a lot of it, so there's a lot of interest in measuring it. But the Raj Chetty work that Scott was mentioning, we now, of course, there's always going to be measurement error up at the top of the income distribution. There's measurement error at the bottom as well. But we now have data on top incomes because those things are not measured well in household surveys, but they're measured better in the tax records. And so we now have data where we can look at the top 1% or the 0.1%. We can isolate those folks. And on the poverty measurement side, the SPM is just a huge advance. And it's great that you can get SPM numbers not only from academics like me, but also from the Census Bureau, so that you can go to the Census Bureau website, you can Google Census Bureau Supplemental Poverty Measure, and you can get their most recent one. And you can find poverty rates using both the official and the supplemental measure for individual states, for particular subgroups, because a lot of the interest in this is in the subgroups. You may be interested in a particular age group, a particular geographic group, and there's lots of detail there, and we can always produce more detail. So a lot of what we're working on now is looking at single-parent families, looking at young children, looking at young adults, looking at particularly vulnerable groups, starting to look at some states in detail. So I would say, use the Census Bureau because they have really good poverty statistics. Raj Chetty, we've talked about, is just producing lots of papers on inequality and is very well respected. The Piketty book is a great read. His Capital book is a great read on inequality. And
700 pages.
yeah, no, it's a great read.
That's the first time I've heard somebody say that.
It's a great read. He writes really well. Pick a chapter, pick one chapter and read it. It's a great read. And ask us. Don't hesitate to ask us. If you have a question about, I'm really interested in knowing what's going on with young children in my state or in this city, or do you have anything on immigrants or whatever, ask us, because chances are good we either have it or we can point you to it.
So I want to ask one more question, then really open it up, and that is, you both presented amazing data for us, and Jane, more than you, Scott, offered implicitly a causal explanation. So we have the data here, we have policy interventions here, and then we have that black box in the middle of causes. Mm-hmm. So I want to tease that out from both of you a bit more, whether you believe inequality or mobility or poverty is increased or stayed the same or decreased. I wanted you to say more about why you believe that. What are the causal explanations for both of the data that you presented? And again, Jane, you said it, you implied it more than Scott did, but I want to tease it out from both of you very explicitly.
So on income concentration, so inequality, I think you have a different set of causes depending if you're talking about inequality below the top, so sort of between the upper middle class and the bottom, versus the top 1% and everybody else. So the top 1% and everybody else, no one can say with certainty what's going on. I think there are a couple of big factors, one of which is globalization. And so as the world's economy globalizes, that does a couple things. It makes finance a lot more important relative to the rest of the economy in terms of allocating capital efficiently. So a lot of the rise in the top 1% has come in the finance sector. But it also makes it more important as a company to have not the second best person running it, but the best person running it. And so to some extent, there's been a bid up in pay at the top. I think the easiest way to think about this is in terms of something like Major League Baseball. Guys aren't supposed to go to sports metaphor. I hate baseball. But essentially, like, the idea is that to Major League Baseball, the importance of the best player in the league, I can't even tell you who that is far more important to the second best guy in the league. And so you actually have the same degree of income concentration among Major League Baseball players as you do kind of in the United States as a whole. Second factor is, I think the decline in tax rates, starting primarily in the early 1980s, has made a difference. In a couple different ways. First, I think it has made the returns to holding out for the best offer a lot greater. So if I am that top CEO, I have a lot more incentive to negotiate hard. But I also have more incentive just to work generally and to work more. And so I think the fact that rates have been lowered affects pay at the top that way. It also makes it easier for shareholders to pay the CEO more, right? If you wanted to give the CEO a giant raise, but 70% of it was going to be taxed away, why give the CEO a big raise, right? Whereas if less of it's being taxed away, then there's more incentive to give the CEO the big raise. The other thing that I think is interesting that we don't have good data for is that it could be actually that we had a lot more inequality in the 1970s than the data shows, and that essentially what people at the top are really good at doing, and what their accountants are really good at doing, is shifting money around in a way that it doesn't show up on tax returns. Remember, all this top 1% stuff is coming from tax return data. And there are some plausible arguments for how that could happen as relative rates change for capital gains versus ordinary income, for corporations versus individuals. There are a lot of strategies folks can use, and that's sort of the shifts that I showed you in around 1986 reflects that people do this. Now, how much of the increase or apparent increase it accounts for, nobody can really say, and I wouldn't push hard that it's been a huge factor there, but I think it is a factor. I guess I'll stop there. I can talk about more about causes around mobility too in the conversation if folks are interested. That's not too long.
Yeah, so there's the stagnant earnings, which Scott was saying have to do with globalization, technological change. So there's stagnant earnings. So without the green line at the top shows that's basically market income. That's if you only take families' market income into account, their earnings, whoever's working in the family, the income that they're bringing home, their dividends, their interest, sort of all their income that they're getting privately without the government intervening. That's that flat poverty rate. Poverty rate would have been 27% using this measure back in the 60s. It would be 28-something% now. Goes up and down with the economic cycle, but this is really the stagnant earnings, and it's really the effects of globalization, technological change, all of those things. And to the extent that poverty has declined since the 1960s, and on this measure it's declined by 40%, it's the effect of the tax and transfer system. So because we've allocated increasing amounts towards supplementing families' incomes through things like the tax credits and food stamps and Social Security and all of those things that have expanded since the 1960s, that's what's put a dent in poverty. So it's in some ways a sobering story because we're really fighting against the tide. Do you know what I mean? We're really we're fighting against what's going on in the labor market, and it's not it's not just in the United States. As Scott's emphasized, it's a worldwide phenomenon. And so we have had to spend more on the anti-poverty system, but with results. I guess I'll just say that there is an issue then about political will, because this requires political will to keep spending on these programs. And I think that's where there's some concern about growing income inequality, to the extent that that erodes the political will to keep investing in these programs, to the extent that there's a group of people who are cut off from the mainstream and are living essentially in a private sphere, private schools, private housing, private security, less willing to invest. I think that becomes the concern, part of the concern about inequality, because this kind of a picture requires continuing government effort, to sort of to fight against the tide that otherwise is just producing this flat poverty rate. And boy, you can see it in the Great Recession. I'll just end on this. You can see the Great Recession. You can look at the green line kicking up at the end of this period from, say, 2007. That's the Great Recession. That's market income poverty kicking up. And you look at the blue line, and it's flat, thank God. That's the ARRA, right? The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which increased spending on things like food stamps, increased unemployment benefits, increased the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, the little sister was extended, made more generous. So that's the government safety net in action, but it's costly, and it does require the political will. So I think there's a pretty clear causal story here. I absolutely appreciate Scott's point that you have to worry about the behavioral effects, and this is all sort of, accounting exercise, and there could be some behavioral impacts that we need to be concerned about. But I think the basic outline is of what's going on with market incomes as opposed to what's been in the public sector is pretty clear.
Great. Okay, I have so many thoughts and questions, but I'm going to get you in the conversation. So Michael has
I'm going to ask you to speak into the mic.
Hi, like Dorian, I don't know where to begin.
Can you introduce yourself again?
Jeff Madrick, Century Foundation. But let me ask Scott a couple of questions and segue as quickly as I can to Jan.
I think we're now moving into the debate portion.
We may be moving into the debate portion. The best baseball player. Most of the evidence I've seen is that paying a lot for CEOs has not resulted in better performance for corporations. I'm thinking of Bebchuk at Harvard Law School and a lot of other. So if you're right, it should show up in better performance, higher pay. Do you disagree with that research? I have a few questions, so let me just get to that. Let me be very quick because this is really important stuff, and I don't want people to go away thinking all of this is unchallenged. On the 93%, by how much are these people doing better than their parents? And if you took women out of it, because we know women's income rose considerably, and we know men's median wage earnings fell, information out of Brookings. So we need some more information about that. On whether cash or poverty programs work, let me just segue to Jane. A lot of research about child poverty shows that increased cash and cash allowances, and Jane has done this in England, increased cash and cash allowances, at least the American research shows it's led to better outcomes for children. Not just more money or lower poverty rate, but better outcomes, higher educational achievement, and so on. And I think Jane knows a lot about that, so I would swing that question to her. I promise I'll stop.
Okay, let's see. So, are we?
Well, I just wanted to say, and that's not just in the U.S., but in other countries, including Latin America. There have been a lot of experiments around conditional cash transfers. You respond.
Okay, so on the CEO pay point, I think the first thing to say is, you can analogize Major League Baseball again. Just because you're paying the person everybody thinks is the best in the league a lot more than second best or whoever, it's no guarantee that that is going to end up being worth it, right? People are, anybody who hires any employee, any of us in the room, we got hired. Our employers didn't know whether that was going to be a good risk or not, right? So the correlation between the increase in pay or how much pay CEOs make and what their performance is bound to not necessarily be that high. For evidence about whether this is rational to do this, it's interesting. You can go to the IRS website and you can look at income concentration for corporations, and you can't. It doesn't have it neatly organized by the top 1%, but you can kind of look at the brackets and look consistently at the top 2%. So as I showed, the headline Piketty and Saez numbers say that the top 1% of tax returns peaked at 24% in 2007. In 2007, what do you think the top 2% of corporations made for corporate income? 94%. So income is far more concentrated in corporations than it is in the general population as a whole. So to me, that says it's not necessarily crazy. 24% sounds like a big number. In Manhattan, among parents in Manhattan, this is coming from the Chetty data in 2007, the top 1% of parents in Manhattan took home 54% of the income that was received in Manhattan that year. So these numbers could go quite a bit higher. 54% was enough to get Occupy Wall Street on the streets, but Occupy Wall Street was not the Tea Party movement. So I think a case can be made that it's rational for shareholders to pay corporations the amount that they do. Other evidence there is that in privately held companies, you're seeing the same sort of trends in income concentration. So it's not that sort of CEOs are self-dealing or gaming their shareholders. These are trends that you see pretty pervasively. About absolute mobility, so the 84% is how many people are better off than their parents were at the same age after adjusting for inflation. That shows up in the Pew data, whether you adjust for household size or whether you don't. Shows up in that.
That's sons, not daughters, right?
No. So this is all people.
That's all people. Okay.
Yeah. So it could be different for sons and daughters. The 93% was what I gave for the median change versus your parents. So those are two different numbers. You asked how much better off. Well, at the median, it's a 93% improvement. That's accounting for declining household size. If you don't adjust for declining household size, it amounts to $26,000 that 40-year-olds today have over and above what their parents had at the same age. So it's significant. Pew has a great chart that shows that you can actually, I think I meant to say this on the slide that I showed. Essentially, you can be at the high end of the bottom fifth today, and that would have snuck you into the low end of the middle fifth in the previous generation. So this is everyone. It doesn't. I don't know the answer to that. It could be. I mean, so certainly I would disagree that male earnings have declined. They've certainly stagnated. The Brookings report is a disaster. The Hamilton Project report you're talking about. I have a big response to that. Certainly, you can't tell an upbeat story about what's happened to guys over the last 30, 40 years. But a lot of things have changed, including married women really strongly increasing their workforce participation, is what Claudia Golden called the quiet revolution. And essentially what we've seen is guys who were benefiting from kind of getting a male breadwinner premium in this golden period during the 1950s and 60s, where they were paid at least somewhat above and beyond their value to the company because we thought that men should be able to raise a family on one income. The logic of that is completely eroded over time because women realized this was kind of a bum deal. And so we've seen women's earnings increase. We've seen guys' pay stagnate at a level that was probably higher than what a competitive world would have been. So I think that's the male-female story.
Yeah. So you asked about the child transfers and the benefits. Yeah, because I've been emphasizing the benefits on income levels in poverty. There is quite a bit of good evidence now on the impacts of programs like the EITC, not just on income poverty, but on things like child health and child development. So that's a very exciting body of research. It's about a half a dozen studies now with, not random assignment, but sort of natural experiment design, but looking at where these kinds of child tax credits have been expanded and looking at benefits in terms of child health, maternal mental health, children's test scores. So the next generation of that will be the random assignment experiments. So a colleague of mine at Columbia, Kim Noble, Greg Duncan from UC Irvine, Catherine Magnuson from Wisconsin, a group of them are doing a random assignment experiment to give families what they're calling income supplements, so unconditional cash transfers. And so that's underway. They're currently piloting that, but that's underway. I'm working with a colleague at Columbia, Jean Brooks-Gunn, who's a developmental psychologist. We're very interested in pairing these kinds of income supplements with parenting programs. We think that you get a bigger impact of a parenting program if you can address some of the material hardship and the income needs, and you get a bigger bang for the income program if you also provide some parenting support for families with very young children, pregnant women and parents of infants and toddlers. So we're now looking at a random assignment experiment for packaging income support with parenting programs. I think that's the sort of next generation.
Let's get someone on this side of the room. Okay, they're being coy and shy, so we'll come back over here. On the spot.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Pelzer. I'm from the Wallace Foundation. I am a data guy, so this is all catnip for me. But I'm interested in political will and leverage. One of you mentioned that the Occupy movement wasn't the Tea Party movement, and without turning into a political discussion, I'm curious how, in a world where very often policymakers and leaders don't want a little thing like logic or evidence mess up their argument,
right,
how do we create an environment where there is a narrative that the evidence that you are sussing out is actually used in a policymaking discussion? Some of these arguments could be considered the counterfactual. We don't know how bad it would be if this hadn't been there, but we kind of do now. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, from a community standpoint, a philanthropic standpoint, what is the recommendation about how do we take the data that you are producing? How can this actually be used to influence policymakers when there is a huge disincentive for certain people to allow these messages to get out? So how, in this context, can this be used to influence policy from your perspective?
Well, I guess one thing I would say is the more that we disagree with each other about the facts, the more we undermine the ability for policymakers to use the data, because then that just feeds into the idea that, well, we don't really know what the facts are. And so we're actually part of a joint effort to bring people together from the left and the right to agree on a set of facts and a set of policies, and we'll see how we do. We're like, I think we're like 3 meetings in, and we're supposed to go 4 meetings, and we've agreed we need a 5th meeting. But
Agreement.
It's a group of people who are left and right, and we're trying to come to some common ground and release a common report. I guess in the next 3 to 6 months or something. So now I think we're going to go into the fall, and the idea would be that at least provides a platform for policymakers if they want to pick up on some of the ideas, because if they're endorsed by people from both the left and the right, then maybe that makes the process somewhat easier. I don't know. This is being completely optimistic. But.
Does that effort have a name that we could follow or pay attention to?
Or is it a secret?
It has like an internal name, but it's nothing. I mean, this hasn't shown up in the news, right? It's not secretive, but I think it's called the AEI Working Group or something incredibly descriptive like that.
Do you want to respond to that question?
I mean, it's hard. I think policymakers, my experience has been they know where they want to go. Data can help them get there. Great. So I think it is. I think it's fighting uphill battle to some extent. That said, I do think the acknowledgement among conservatives over the last 5 years that upward mobility and opportunity might be a national problem worth addressing, certainly in ways that the left would disagree about, is an example where I think there was something compelling about the data that sort of forced them to take a look at it. There was also all of this inequality data, which I think is flawed, which I think they were looking for something else to talk about that was an income inequality. So that's sort of a good news, bad news answer, I guess. But I think it's really important to really strive to present the data in all its complexities. I think when one side gets a case that conveniently and uniformly supports the other side, understandably, I think they're sort of inclined to say, well, thanks, we'll be in touch. To the extent people can get complicated, that says, well, on one hand, I've tried to tell, I'm a great admirer of Paul Ryan and his staff. As Jane said, they're citing the anchored supplemental poverty stuff a lot, and I think that's fantastic. Congressman Ryan does still say, like, we fought a war on poverty and poverty won, which I think I would agree with Jane is probably an oversimplification. So I think in some ways, I think having appropriately non-grand expectations about what data can do, but to take seriously that it can move things at the margins.
Can I just add that as we're going to the next question, the political science side of me is thinking of all the recent literature on representation and the gap of representation between the most affluent and everyone else. I'm thinking of Martin Gillen's book recently from Princeton, and it just reminds me of something you both just said. There is the data and the evidence that we'd want to play a part in policymaking, but I would hypothesize that one reason why the right has moved to accept that poverty and inequality are issues is that they hear from constituents and their own communities that something is going on. So I think there does have to be some kind of balance between what are policymakers and elected officials hearing from their constituents, in addition to the experts, those of us that are experts and have the evidence in our suitcase, so to speak.
No, I just wanted to say, for me, with the policy piece, starting on the state and local level makes more sense to me.
And who are you, please?
Oh, sorry, I'm Aaron Jacobs from the Ed McConnell Park Foundation. And that's where I see more change happening, and sometimes that can drive federal.
Hi, I'm Rachel Briggenfield from the Rockefeller Foundation, and I'm part of a small team that looks into different ways of framing problems and understanding new problems, and maybe it goes nowhere, or maybe it contributes to our work. And I've just started some new work around economic exclusion in high-income cities. And one of the first kind of observations is that it's not how we talk about these issues in the US. We talk usually in terms of inequality, the framing of this event and the call of Occupy Wall Street, and it really animates our politics right now. But my sense is part of how we arrived at Dorian's question around causes is because in some ways inequality first leads us to a description rather than a causal story. X isn't doing something to Y. And I'm finding that in this exclusion framing, it's sort of forcing me to ask that causal question. So I just wanted to ask, when we think of inequality as this sort of animating framing right now in the US, what does that mean, for us as a room full of people funding interventions, trying to think about these problems in new ways? What are the framings that kind of excite you, that you think could unlock new partnerships, new ways to get involved with this work? And if you care to comment on it, what do you think of this sort of economic exclusion framing? Thanks.
So Bob Putnam, who I have a lot of respect for, is talking mostly about opportunity because it resonates so strongly with American values that all of our kids should have the opportunity. All of our kids should have the opportunity. I mean, who's going to disagree with that? And my view, he may disagree with this, but my view is that he's not really talking about, he's not using the term inequality because the term inequality is contested. You heard Scott say he doesn't agree with some of the data that's been presented around inequality. So inequality becomes contested terrain. It's the most important issue on the left. The people on the right don't agree that it's an issue. It's very contested. So I think, using terms like opportunity, poverty has a meaning. Poverty, we can all agree that we shouldn't have poor kids in America. We just shouldn't, this is just a scandal. We shouldn't have poor kids. So, I try to talk about poverty. I try to talk about opportunity. I think a lot about exclusion. The place that I visit at the LSE is the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion. And so I've had a lot of conversations with people in this country about exclusion. You're right. When you use the term exclusion, that implies that someone's been excluded. Someone's been excluded by someone else. And there is a very strong causal and sort of judgmental message behind that. And I've experienced lots of pushback using that term in the States. Well, if somebody is using substances, somebody's having a kid out of wedlock, somebody's doing these things, they're who excluded them? They chose, it gets very contested. So I can understand why you're using the term, and it's been very powerful in the UK. And they used it for particular groups. They used it for the most disadvantaged in society, people who were sleeping rough, the homeless, kids leaving foster care. Where there's lots of consensus that these folks, in some sense, have been excluded and really have been. They really are at the margins of society. But I don't know. I'll be interested to see how that work goes. But for me, the poverty, talking about opportunity, feels like it works. I guess the other thing I would say is there's a great political scientist at Georgetown, William Gormley, who wrote a book called Voices for Children. So he does a lot of work on preschool, empirical work, but he also did this book about framing and political support for spending on children, both at the state level and the federal level. And he did lots of experiments, sort of vignette studies, where he gave people material framed in different ways and then assessed their support. And then he did that also with staffers in Congress. And the opportunity frame really worked well with everybody. Now talking about inequality and talking about injustice and making the kind of moral case also worked well with some groups, women, Democrats, liberals, you can sort of picture who it was. So he said, it's not like you do harm if you talk about inequality and make the moral case. Nation as rich as America, kids shouldn't be poor, that case I was just making. That resonates with a lot of us in this room. Other people, it just leaves cold. But when you talk about opportunity and you make the economic case, these are economic investments. You invest $1 today in these kids and it's going to pay off in the next generation of parents, then you pick up more support. So that's another kind of interesting body of work because it's very empirical. And it's another good read. Whether it's better than Piketty, it's shorter.
It's got to be shorter, right?
It is shorter. It's a very good read, and it's called Voices for Children.
I don't have a lot to add to that.
There's another book that comes to mind, which is much shorter than the Piketty book, and it's by political scientists Larry Jacobs and Ben Page. And they look at public opinion polls over many, many decades, a few hundred. And the argument of the book, which is compelling based on what Jane just said, is that Americans are philosophically conservative but operationally liberal. Meaning you ask them philosophical questions about, say, the role of government, tend to be more conservative. If you ask them questions about specific programs, like the EITC, very, very liberal. So it's just an interesting cognitive dissonance, might we say, for lack of a better term, depending on how you ask and frame the question. And again, they use hundreds of polls over the last couple of decades. So it's a very short, I think it's about 100 pages or so, book that you should check out. Someone over here. Yes, finally. This side is awakened.
Nancy Leonard from Connecticut, Grassland Memorial Fund. So I wondered in this framing conversation, and also in your research and the data look around the role of business in all of this in this country. Given that we're global, we're not going to change that. There's a different level of competitiveness. However, I think that there seems to be perhaps an opening where some CEOs at least are coming forward and saying, I'm capping, or we're capping my salary at X. And on the other side, there's a push in Connecticut. There's a bit and put that into the coffers for the various safety net programs. So, there's some real kind of different styles of engagement here, but where are there opportunities? Is there any data? I mean, I think that the safety net, there's a lot of talk and research about the impact of that on individuals. We haven't really looked at the impact of that on business.
Well, I guess I am a conservative in this regard. I tend to think that, I tend to think two things. First of all, I think the most important thing that a business can do is create jobs and provide jobs, and that's anything beyond that is fantastic. We should praise people who go above and beyond to be especially good employers. But I think to the extent we don't like market distribution of income or power, that's for government. That's to do something about, I think. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I get very nervous, and a lot of conservatives do, about the idea that you can just put mandates on employers and get sort of the outcome that you're hoping to get from it and avoid any downside from it, right? So the minimum wage, I think, is a fascinating debate. Large body of research shows that the experience we've had in the past with raising the minimum wage is that it hasn't produced the big employment declines that theory would predict. So that's been used to argue for increasing the national minimum wage to $10.15. The Economic Policy Institute is starting to talk about 15, I think, 12. Okay. And you have cities that are looking at 15, and Seattle that's done 15, some other places as well. The research cannot tell us whether going from 7.25 to 10.15 is going to have an impact on job loss, right? It turns out that 10.15 would be higher than the high we ever had in 1968. You hear some bad statistics sometimes that it was that high in 1968. 1968 used what I think is the best cost of living adjustment. The minimum wage in today's dollars is about $8.35. So the leading proposal among Democrats is to put it higher than it's ever been and index it, so it's permanently higher than it's ever been. I get very nervous about that.
That's a contested empirical. I just want to.
Can I respond to that? But what about the fact that so many of us in my generation right now are going very deep into that during college education?
Well, I mean.
I'm Micah Wood from the Arcus Foundation. I worked at a nonprofit before coming into the foundation world, and I took on a massive amount of debt to get a bachelor's degree. And my net effective wage when I made my way to the nonprofit world was actually no better than making minimum wage. And yeah, I have no savings to show, and this is it's a catastrophe right now. It's the next bubble coming. And also I'm sorry, I was a late joiner. Did we address labor unions?
So I just want to make sure. So let's put the college tuition question on the table, and I want to make sure that Jane, you get a chance to respond to the question about employers, particularly in the context of I'm struck by Aetna and Facebook recently saying they're going to $15 an hour for all their employees, including subcontracted employees. So think janitors, bus drivers, food service workers, say at Facebook campus. This was Facebook did it like that.
And these are voluntary employer efforts. So again, in the spirit of agreement, there's disagreement about what you mandate on employers, but I think there's probably no disagreement about exhorting employers to voluntarily do what they can as good citizens. And it's in the realm of pay. It's also in the realm of work family benefits is the other place we're seeing it. So I think was it Marissa Meyer who just just going to provide paid leave for all of her employees, or provide extra income if they don't have paid leave. So that's another arena where there's been lots of activity at the state level. And I think the leave example is a good example of sometimes it's a mandate, sometimes it's a public benefit. So we don't have a mechanism in this country for publicly funded sick leave. We just don't have that kind of apparatus. It would be very difficult to build. So that means there's been a movement across cities and states to mandate employers to provide a minimal amount of paid sick leave. And so that does run right up against what Scott was talking about, the sort of opposition to employer mandates. And people from New York City know this was very contested and was a big factor in the last mayoral election. It was probably part of why Christine Quinn lost, because she had opposed paid sick leave, a mandate on employers, and she lost a lot of support on the left because of that. But then there's paid family leave, where that really then goes sort of to mandate on employers that they hold a job open and pay somebody in our culture is so difficult. And we do have an apparatus. We do have a public apparatus for that. So states have gone a very different direction around paid family leave. And so they're setting up in New Jersey, Rhode Island, California, public funds where employees, not employers, employees pay in a few dollars a week. And in the event that they have a family or medical leave need, they can then claim from that public fund, and they can be out for a period of time with a newborn or with somebody who's ill or for their own illness. So that to me is, there's not some absolute position of do you mandate employers or do you have a public benefit? It's sort of what's the context, what's the institutional framework, and so those are two completely different solutions.
And then I just want to make sure we don't lose Micah's college tuition question and the cost of higher education. Do you want to respond to that, please?
Yeah, so to me, that's not a minimum wage problem. And to me, that is a problem of tuition inflation. And I do think that's gotten really out of control. And in large part, I think it's gotten out of control for two reasons. One is that you have a lot of more elite institutions that are kind of in this bidding war for amenities, right? So I went to Northwestern as an undergrad. We had this amazing student center, glass, 50-foot ceiling overlooking Lake Michigan. College has become a consumption good in a lot of ways for some of the elite and more expensive places, and that's put upward pressure on tuition. And I think there are a lot of things you could do to inject more competition. Not just through traditional universities, but through online stuff, through new forms of higher ed, new ways of accrediting alternative places. But then also, I think government subsidy in the form of Pell Grants and student loans has also pushed up tuitions, because colleges and universities can get some of the benefits of that, right? They can raise their tuition up, whereas they might not have before. And I think there are better ways that we could fund higher ed. So Senator Marco Rubio has a proposal for income share agreements that I think is really interesting, which would essentially create a legal framework that would allow private investors to fund students' higher ed. And so if you got into 3 schools, some investor could say, I'm going to pay your way, you're going to owe me 2% of your pay for 10 years. But if you go to this school, which is a dropout factory, you're going to owe me 4% of your pay for 10 years. Well, so it doesn't reduce freedom at all. You would still have the ways that we currently have to finance higher ed. You could take on the student loan debt to go to a place where the market was telling you not to go. You could major in programs. I was a sociology major, not the most practical. Theater or literature. You could still do those things and accept the student loan debt. Or you could take this alternative route. The other thing it would do is it would force colleges and universities to be competitive and care about graduating their students. The real people who are hurting are not the people who graduate with a degree with a lot of debt, because that's going to pay off in the end. It doesn't feel like it now. That's going to pay off in the end. The real tragedies are the people who go through 2 years, take on a lot of student debt, drop out, and then they've still got the debt.
All right, let's get somebody. You can go at it with Scott after, but we're going to get some more voices in here.
I would like to point out that we are at our time ending. Aren't we? We're at 10? Sorry. We got 15 more minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say, right.
I get weird on these weird time schedules when we started
Can't
like
get to
9:15. I can't get off my half hour. Sorry.
I'm Aaron Jacobs from the Ed McConnell Clark Foundation, and I actually jotted down cost of higher ed on my paper a long time ago at the beginning of this, and I didn't really know what to do with it, so I'm glad you brought it up. But I think it has it's a broader issue. And my question and thoughts are around, so a lot of work we do is around education, and a lot of the organizations we fund are now graduating kids who are working at the Gap or Starbucks or whatever with student loan debt. So your comment about it paying off, I'm not so sure about anymore. So my question really is, what jobs? How many are in our bottom 2/5? If we have them get a college education and promise them that if they do this, they'll be better off, what jobs are there that will put them and keep them in sort of the next fifth? And I don't know what the answer is.
Let me add some data that'll be controversial and get you to respond. So data point 1, it is true that the payoff to higher education based on historical data has been good. We don't know the future, actually, but here are 2 data points. 1, go to the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, look at the job projections. 16 of the 20 fastest growing occupations require no more than a high school degree. They're low wage occupations projected out to 2020. Just as a data point. Number 2, if you probably heard about the recent Oxford study, and this is very controversial, that looked last year at what percentage of jobs in the American economy could be robotized, so the robots are coming, and this time it's different, they would say. 47% of current jobs in the American economy can be robotized. That was the headline of that study. So just want to throw that out there to make the discussion more interesting as you figure out an answer to Aaron's question.
Do you want to go? Or? Okay.
No,
I'll jump in again.
I've been trying to be on a positive, optimistic note, and now
I'm just going where the data is.
Now we're,
Okay, so
these are, structural problems of the American economy and the world economy, and it is, I always say, we have a choice to go down the high road or the low road, and I still think there's a high road we can go down with skills and training, but we can't be sending people to pay a lot of money for diplomas that are going to be worthless. And the folks that you're talking about, are these folks going to 4-year colleges? These are folks going to community colleges, taking remedial courses, not getting any kind of credential because they haven't been well prepared in high school. They're going to community colleges where they're being forced to take the same courses again that they failed in high school, that have no relationship to any kind of career or jobs. So of course, then they end up with debt, or we're throwing government money away. Yeah, we just